Hello. So it's what day is it today? February the 17th. I just finished reading Deleuze and Guattari's The Anti-Oedipus yesterday, and it's a big achievement because I've been reading this book for 6 years with other books at the same time, of course. But I finally finished this, and so I feel somewhat accomplished. And there's this question though, that does this really have anything to do with my astrology channel? And however, we didn't just have a Sun-Saturn conjunction in Aquarius, but at the point where I'm making this video, that's already perfected, and the Sun is separating from Saturn. But it sort of marks the beginning and ending of a new Saturn cycle, and Deleuze himself, I believe, is a Capricorn. I haven't looked at his chart before doing this video, but I know he's got strong Capricorn influence. Also a Jupiter in Capricorn, which is like Jupiter is a teacher, and he tends to be very materialistic, so I often think that the Jupiter in Capricorn influence kind of influences philosophy from an astrology point of view. But I like reading this stuff, but at the end of the day, I'm still a guy who likes astrology. And there's this question of I think a lot of people are looking into different avenues or whatever, people may forego exploring certain things because they have a certain set of beliefs, and then there's a question of does this go with the set of beliefs I have, or does it challenge the set of beliefs that I have, or does it complement the set of beliefs that I have, or does it, or the big question nowadays that I'm noticing as we're going through a period of economic depression is the number one question is there a way to make money off of this? Who cares what it means? Can I make a buck off of it, right? Unfortunately, but I don't know if this is do you any good for that one. But there's something about Deleuze that I can't help but. Well, basically, as I was learning astrology, I was also reading this book. I kind of got into it around the same time around the time I started learning astrology, Deleuze appeared in my life, and it was kind of this parallel thing of trying to figure out Deleuze, and it kind of strikes me that I could just make, Deleuze videos if I wanted to and see where that goes, right? But there's this kind of, like, whether or not I've made a few videos on another channel that doesn't have to do anything with astrology, but if I'm doing this for my astrology channel, I can see that finishing a difficult book while Mercury and Saturn and the Sun are in Aquarius, completing the Sun and Saturn synodic cycle before a new cycle and stuff like this, it actually goes quite well with it, I would say. And especially Aquarius is, I think, the sort of critical theory, kind of scientific. He talks all about like the revolutionary force of arts and science. It's very Aquarian. It's pretty cool stuff, actually. I'm enthusiastic about it, and I already started to weave together this thing where I made a video talking about Bergson, which through way of Dane Rudhyar. Basically, just read Dane Rudhyar's Astrology of Personality because he's incorporating Bergsonian philosophy into his astrology, and then Deleuze also incorporates Bergsonian philosophy into his philosophy, and then so you can kind of like, and there's these points where I don't think Deleuze would want to just go to astrology based on the philosophy that he's doing, but there are certain points where you can kind of like spin it in that direction if you want to, and I'm going to read such a part to give an example. This is on page 292 of the Penguin edition here. He's talking about Wilhelm Reich. If the details of Reich's final theory are taken into consideration, we admit that its simultaneously schizophrenic and paranoiac nature is no obstacle where we are concerned. On the contrary, we admit that any comparison of sexuality with cosmic phenomena, such as electrical storms, the blue color of the sky and the blue-gray of the atmospheric haze, the blue of the orgone, the St. Elmo's fire, the bluish formations of sunspot activity, fluids and flows, matters and particles, in the end appear to us more adequate than the reduction of sexuality to the pitiful little familialist secret. We think that Lawrence and Miller have a more accurate evaluation of sexuality than Freud, even from the viewpoint of the famous scientificity. It is not the neurotic stretched out on the couch who speaks to us of love, of its force and its despair, but the mute stroll of the schizo. Lens outing in the mountains under the stars, the immobile voyage in intensities on the body without organs. As to the whole of Reichian theory, it possesses the incomparable advantage of showing the double pole of the libido as a molecular formation on the microscopic scale and as an investment of the molar formations on the scale of social and organic aggregates. All that is missing is the confirmations of common sense. Why, in what sense is this sexuality? And well, they're talking about sexuality, but where I'm kind of going with this is the idea of the eros principle being primary to what comes out as the function of sexuality in terms of like would be like a sexual intercourse or something like this, but there's a fundamental eros that you can see in what Reich is talking about with different phenomena such as sunspot activity, and you could talk about solar flares, and then you could talk about different atmospheric conditions like weather patterns, and then you could talk about like different pressures and different like how the human biological physiological system, like the way that people get headaches if the weather's a certain way, and then the way that it's like your whole body is interfaced with the environment in all these different ways, and that there's a kind of it works at this cosmic level with stars and planets and forces of alignments and stuff like this. If you go into the naturalistic philosophy, and so this is a way basically to flesh out what I was talking about in that other video about a naturalistic Deleuzian Bersonian Rudhyarian direction, and that whether or not the whole point though is and then this is by way of Wilhelm Reich too. So bringing Wilhelm Reich into it now. There's this kind of issue. I did also. So this is the whole point of it with the Anti-Oedipus is they're in that piece of text they're favoring D.H. Lawrence and they're favoring Henry Miller over the perspective of Freud, and Henry Miller being a guy who's developing his perspective from getting astrological charts done from Dane Rudhyar. But this is what I'm saying is that Dane, there's a certain faux pas about astrology and being in the intellectual circuit, and I don't think that Deleuze really wants to go in that direction. But the whole thing, I don't know if I need to explain it or not, but I was taking courses from a guy, J.F. Martel, from Weird Studies, and he also introduced me to the work of Buber, and there's actually a part in here, I don't know if I can find it, or if I should go into that right now, but let's see if I can find it, maybe. Yeah, here we go. Should I do this one now? There's this issue that I have with Deleuze and astrology, though. The main, like, if I'm making this video, I may as well go for it, because there's certain points of tension where I would probably break with what the perspective as put forth in this book, which is, let's get down to it. So he's talking about, there's this whole thing about what it is, the causal factor that makes mental illness, and is it, like the whole thing about R.D. Laing is that R.D. Laing ends up putting a lot of the emphasis on mental illness as the social, or whatever, the familial factor, and it turns into this whole thing that people don't like because it's like putting too much blame on the parents, and that if it's just a biological thing, if it's just a kind of a gene that is either activated or not, and it activated in different circumstances, then the parents may be one influence, but it could be other circumstances which activate the gene or something, or that if you look at what I was trying to say about David Hume, that there's a complex dynamic of all sorts of interconnected things you call causation and different stresses that are playing out at different levels, and sort of thing is that what's the stressors that the parents are faced with, whether the traumas that the parents are faced with, and then we talk about intergenerational traumas become a trendy thing to talk about, and breaking the train of trauma and all this, right? But there's this thing. I'll just start here, and they talk the familiar idea where they talk about the double bind, and Deleuze here. It sounds like it's Deleuze, anyways, rather than Guattari is criticizing the double bind as being. He doesn't agree with the double bind theory of schizophrenia, and so he says, for example, Bateson's double impasse or double bind, where there is a father who doesn't simultaneously transmit the two contradictory injunctions. Let's be friends, son. I am the best friend you've got. And watch out, son. Don't treat me like one of your buddies. This is actually interesting, though, because, the Langian people really play off this one. Because the whole thing is like, when you are dealing with people like your family members, or when you're dealing with people that are your friends, this basic primary thing is like, is this person your friend or is this person your foe? And then you have to like read the constant cues that people are saying, like, I'm your friend, we can get along, we can cooperate, we can live like socially as a friendly, or like, you do not treat me as your friend, I'm not your buddy, you better watch it around me because you can't, this kind of aggressive kind of stuff. And that there's, in any social dynamic, there's going to be like different different things, and Deleuze is trying to argue that it's not so abnormal for those dynamics to be there. He says, there is nothing there with which to make a schizophrenic. We have seen in this sense that the double impasse is no way defined a specific schizophrenic mechanism, but merely characterize Oedipus in the whole of its extension. There is a veritable impasse, a veritable contradiction. It is the one into which the researcher himself is led when he claims to assign schizophrenic social mechanisms and at the same time to discover them within the order of the family, which the social production and the schizophrenic process escape. This contradiction is perhaps especially perceptible in Lang because he is most revolutionary of the anti-psychiatrists. At the very moment he breaks with psychiatric practice, undertakes assigning a veritable social genesis to psychosis, and calls for a continuation of the voyage as a process for the dissolution of the normal ego, he falls back into the worst familialist, personological, and egoic postulates, so that the remedies invoked are no more than a sincere corroboration among parents, a recognition of the real persons, and a discovery of the true ego or self, as in Martin Buber. Which this is, I find really interesting, actually, because this is a fundamental kind of break where Lang is all about looking at this whole thing about there being a split between the false self, and which is kind of like what Carl Jung talks about, a personality 1 and a personality 2, and the idea of, there's a video of a guy talking about emergent phenomenon, right? Of the emergent phenomenon of another personality that isn't the socially conditioned ego that is born of the whatever the conditions, but is of a it's kind of like the bodhisattva who realizes he's a bodhisattva and has to do this, live a different life because of it could be, in that, I'm not saying that's literally what it always is, but it's a story, like if you treat it as a mythological sense of you're reincarnated to do a certain thing, or else somebody could have a delusion that they're Jesus or something, and they have to do, you could build a story around it, right? But without building up a story about it, there's the idea of find the discovery of the authentic self, and in the Far East, spirituality. That's kind of like the Atman, right? Or that's the Atman on the Brahman and the Guru and the Self and all this kind of stuff. And that the thing is that's my experience is dealing more with people who deal with it like that than people that are French philosophers who talk about funny stuff, right? Like this is more foreign to me than I come from more of a background of hanging out with people who are meditating than hanging out with people who are teaching philosophy classes. So this is kind of interesting to me though, because there's not really much conversation to be had. I don't find that they're kind of like, if you approach the spirituality in this way, they're often like, okay, you're running your prefrontal cortex circuit in your mind and stuff like this and doing analytical things. You tend to shut up and meditate or go and chop some wood, or you know what I mean? Like there's not really, or you listen to some Alan Watts and that just sorts it out, right? And it's not really that complicated. But the R.D. Laing, anyways, is kind of from the 60s, and it's more about like this whole discovering the authentic self and all this kind of stuff. And there's something about Deleuze just doesn't like that direction in this whole thing. The I thou of and I took these courses from J.F. Martel, and this is what I find why I actually like J.F. Martel is because J.F. Martel calls himself a Deleuzian, but he's also a practicing Catholic, which seems like a bit of a contradiction. But not for him, he's just building his own philosophy, and he's kind of got this attitude that, like, if you read Deleuze, like Deleuze will just go in there Deleuze will write about Spinoza, or Deleuze will write about Nietzsche, and he'll just go in and take little bits of the other, and he's like, well, that's Deleuze, right? So we can read Deleuze and Guattari, and we can go to this part where Deleuze and Guattari is talking about Buber and the I thou, and Deleuze makes this move where Deleuze, like I'm saying, you're either approving or denying or accepting or rejecting, and Deleuze rejects Buber and then goes and says we should go in another direction. And then there's people like G.F. Martel, which hits that and would say that he accepts Buber and then, incorporates at least some of the Deleuzian philosophy, but accepting Buber and spinning it. But this is the whole thing what Deleuze, what this book is about, though, is Deleuze kind of makes this argument not to go in this direction, to do this other thing. But, like, I think JF's trying to, still incorporate that into his philosophy. Whatever, I don't know. This is, maybe if JF ends up watching this, then he can reply to it or something like that. But I'm kind of using this idea to navigate my relationship with Deleuze, and that I do enjoy. My point, though, is that when you're approaching philosophy, a lot of people might be like, the time and effort to invest into a book like this. And if the guy is just being against all this stuff that I have aligned myself with that I'm in support of, isn't this guy just an asshole? Isn't this guy just an enemy to what I'm supposed to represent? But that's not actually what it's about, because that's a very us and them kind of way of thinking, right? That's like the two wolves inside of you. Which are you going to feed, the Deleuze wolf, or are you going to feed the good wolf? No, the whole point of Deleuze and Guattari is that you've got one wolf, or you got the good wolf, and the good wolf is also basically affirms, what does it affirm? The Oedipus. That affirms the Oedipus, which it says the good wolf automatically, if you put down this bullshit, son, then the other thing is you grow up, you get a job, you get a family, you become a householder, you become a productive member of society, and you fit in like the rest of us. And all the question, what is there to ask a question about? It's obvious. You do what you have to do. You become a good man. You become a good father. And you don't have to think about anything. And you know what I'm saying? Like total brain death and also fucking slavery to a debt machine that treats you like a piece of trash, that doesn't have any respect for your own autonomy and your own ability to make your own decisions and your own choices, that just treats you like a piece of garbage, and so that's essentially what we are resisting by doing Deleuze and Guattari and incorporating that into our work. I don't know, or maybe that's not a good idea, but this is where the schizo flow works for me, as you can see the spinning wheels in motion or whatever, right? Okay, well I don't know. Is that too? you have the bit of the confrontational anarchism of Deleuze can still incorporate into the astrology practice, or at least for me, in some way it works, but it challenges the whole what the analysis is always built on this thing that the answer is obvious, and the answer is always just be fit into a heteronormative, familial, productive householder, or that if you read other people's writing, it's always written to be like, well, if you're reading this book, obviously you're a non-disabled father figure, employed, responsible person, and if you're not, you're just like a schizo and you should go fuck off, right? And basically. So it's like this is essentially challenging that model of what society says you're supposed to be, what you're supposed to do with your life, and resisting it basically. And I think that we don't have to get rid of the fundamental. You don't have to get rid of the absolute, and you don't have to get rid of the Atman, and you don't have to get rid of. But there's all these cultural structures that are built up, but the question is that the same structures that build up that kind of thing will also build up a caste system that keeps a whole section of people locked into a life of poverty and slavery and stuff like this. And so by its very nature, how do you sort that out? That we're doing this in process of, we call it democracy, but how many countries are democratic in the total? There's only a few countries that even have democracies, and you're trying to treat freedom as if the freedom of democracy is an absolute virtue, an absolute principle, and we haven't even begun to make the world democratic. If that's ever going to happen, that it's like, and you talk about freedom, and well, you got slaves making cat food for you, and you talk about freedom. Who are you to talk about freedom when you keep these animals enslaved, and you enslave slaves to feed them for you, and your only freedom is your own dissociation from that process, because it's out of capitalism that you can have money making, and that you can just be dissociated from the fact that you're a lazy son of a bitch and it's enslaving everybody else, But I don't know. This is the problem with Deleuze and Guattari and doing videos like this. I'm sorry, I have to apologize. Maybe I'm just this. Maybe this is like, and it's not the right thing to do. Well, it is a Sun-Saturn kind of thing, though, right? Is it not? I don't know. Whatever.